It may be only the middle of Seahawks OTAs, but training camp is just around the corner, and so is the start of the 2024 regular season. Which 53 players right now would be on the roster if the Seahawks played the Broncos tomorrow? Rob Rang and I'll be discussing our first projections here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in nearby Tacoma or across the country in Boston, Massachusetts. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week, and hope everybody had an amazing Memorial Day. We are getting closer to the start of training camp. It's still 2 months away, roughly, but we're halfway through OTAs, so that means it's time for our first 53-man roster projection. We'll be looking at our last 5 in, the first 5 out, and of course, all 53 players that Rob and I are projecting to make this football team if they were to play the Broncos at Lumen Field tomorrow. Going to be a jam-packed episode brought your way by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks will have their second open OTA practice to the media coming up on Thursday. After today, though, they are halfway through their 10 OTA practices, which means it's time for our first 53-man roster projections of the season. And Rob, before we dive into our 53-player rosters as we go deeper into the show, I love to take a March Madness spin in May. And what I mean by that is looking at our last 5 players that make the team and the first 5 that don't. And so let's start on the positive side of things. And you and I had to comb through the 90-man roster and figure out which 53 are going to be on this football team. Who were the last 5 players that were in to make your first 53-man roster projection of the 2024 season?
Yeah, Corbin, I think that you just gave an excellent comparison to what this exercise really is. I of course, with the NFL draft, I basically equate this to creating an NFL mock draft right after the previous draft ended. And so this is obviously a very early projection. As you just said, of course, we have not had training camp, and there's going to be all kinds of things that are going to change. But still, at this point in the year, my last 5 guys who I do think are going to make the final 53. That's going to be the 4th round cornerback out of Auburn, Nehemiah Pritchett, a rookie. The offensive lineman from Utah, Satoa Laumea, a rookie. The offensive lineman, Michael Jarrell from Finley, again, a rookie. The inside linebacker, John Radigan, and then the wide receiver / return man, D. Eskridge. Those are 5 players, in my opinion, who are currently on the bubble, who I project at this point actually making Seattle's final 53-man roster.
Yeah, you and I are going to have some stark differences here, and I can promise our listeners that you and I do not collaborate on this. I send you my thing, and then you put together your 53-man roster. We do it every time like this. We aren't sitting together on StreamYard or on Zoom or whatever and just kicking the can about, how can we come up with differences? We do these separately. So as far as my last 5 that are on the roster here, I'm going to start with Kobe Bryant, and my rationale behind that is I absolutely think that Bryant is on the bubble, but I think Jarek Reed II's knee injury, coming back from a torn ACL, from what I have been told, the likelihood of him being ready for week 1 is less than 50%. So I'm going to go with, at this projection, Jarek Reed II is still on the PUP list for at least 4 weeks. So Kobe Bryant is going to make this team as an extra safety / corner. Stone Forsythe, Derek Young making this final roster. Satawa Lamea at left guard behind Laken Tomlinson. And I've got Jack Westover. And I know some of our listeners will be like, oh no, he's got his former player making the Seahawks roster. But listen, this is a new offense that's being installed by Ryan Grubb. And we're talking about a guy that can catch the football. He comes through in clutch moments. He knows this offense inside and out. Geno Smith has name dropped him a couple times already at this point. And I'm sorry, but I think Jack Westover has a lot of potential to be a really solid NFL tight end. I can't see Seattle letting him go with that connection with Ryan Grubb. So he is the 53rd player that makes this roster. He's my last one that is in, and gives the Seahawks 4 tight ends, but I think special teams is going to play into that as well. We've seen him keep 4 running backs before. I think 4 tight ends in this projection because A.J. Barner and Jack Westover can both play special teams, which is going to give them value for the Seahawks. Now, on the flip side, Rob, anytime you come up with a 53-man roster projection, there's going to be a bunch of players that are going to get pink slips, but there are always those handful of guys that are squarely on the bubble that come up just short. And I had 7 or 8 guys that I could have mentioned here that this was really tricky with, but we're going to whittle it down to 5, the first 5 off the roster for you in this initial projection.
Yeah, and as you said, Corbin, you had 7 or 8 guys. I mean, I had 10. I have 10 here listed that I just think are right on the edge. But I'm going to list my first 5 out, so to speak. And you mentioned Kobe Bryant. I think that you can make a strong argument that if Jarek Reed is still coming off of the injury, or is still not healthy, he obviously is coming off the knee injury. Then again, I do think that there is a possibility that that Jarek Reed beats him out if he's healthy, but there's a possibility that Kobe Bryant is the better man up and Jarek Reed is not available. But Kobe Bryant would be where I would start this conversation. And so to me, he is a really interesting player to watch. Miles Adams, a player that we have talked about so many times in the past. His versatility, I think, is going to be really intriguing. But at the same time, I'm just, again, there's so many bodies that the Seahawks have added since Mike Macdonald was brought in as head coach that I just don't know if Miles Adams is going to have the same pull with Mike Macdonald that he had previously with Pete Carroll. Jack Westover, I 100% agree with you, sir. I'm a big fan of Jack Westover. I actually grade him as a 5th-round prospect. And so the idea that he is not going to make Seattle's team outright is a little bit crazy to me, but I am, again, very excited about the talent that the Seahawks have at the tight end positions. Quickly, wide receiver Derek Young, running back George Halani. I believe that both of those 2 players are, as the 3 other players I just mentioned, are legitimate NFL players, in my opinion. I just don't know that they are going to be able to crack a very deep and talented wide receiver and running back positions for the Seahawks to be able to make the initial 53. I think the Seattle is hoping that both of those players might be available to them as practice squad candidates.
Yeah, those guys that are the last ones that get cut, those are always the ones that you are kind of holding your breath. Are we going to be able to bring them back on our practice squad? Now, receivers and running backs, you typically have more luck with that because there is a saturation at those positions, especially at receiver. But for me, with my first 5 out, I'm starting with the former 2nd-round pick, D. Eskridge, and he's off to it again as far as playing well in OTAs. We have seen this story before. Until I see him get through training camp completely healthy or without a suspension, I just find it hard to believe that he's going to offer the Seahawks more than Derek Young, who, quite frankly, I know D. Eskridge has good return potential, but Derek Young is one of the best special teams players on this football team. And he's just about as athletic. I could see Young getting a chance to return kickoffs at some point, especially with the new rules. He's got a former running back background. So I just think time runs out for D. Eskridge, at least right now. George Halani, as you mentioned, I've got him as the number 2 guy that's off the roster. I think he's going to give Kenny McIntosh all that he can handle for that last running back spot, but I just don't think keeping 4 running backs is going to be in the cards, at least initially. And this is where you and I kind of divert a little bit. Hayden Hatton, the receiver out of Idaho, yes, there's only been 1 open OTA practice, but I'm telling you, Rob, keep a very close eye on that kid because his ability to get open, high point the football, really soft hands, savvy route runner. I think he's a better athlete than what maybe his testing is going to suggest too. This is a kid to keep a very close eye on in that very loaded receiver group. So I've got him just barely missing. Tremaine Ankrum, who was signed early in free agency, he signed well before we saw Laken Tomlinson come to town. And of course the 2 draft picks as well. I just think Haynes and Satao Lamea are both going to be better options right out of the gate than Ankrum. I don't know where he fits into this mix at this point, so I've got him on there. And the last player that is out for me on my list, Michael Jarrell, and this is going to surprise some people, but I'm basing this, Rob, on the fact that Garrett Greenfield, the undrafted rookie, has been getting as many looks at right tackle to this point. And I know it was just one open OTA, but Greenfield was getting the first opportunity with the second team offense, not Mike Jarrell. Now, could that change very quickly? Absolutely. But I think this kid he's got a lot of development that needs to be done coming from Division II. So I think he's going to improve, but I just don't know that he's going to have quite enough to make this team. They're going to be hoping they can get him to the practice squad. When we come back next, we're going to continue our initial 53-man roster predictions here in the middle of OTAs. We're going to be looking at our offensive depth charts at every single position. Who's going to be making the 53? Who we think is going to be starting in week 1 against the Broncos? We'll get to those up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. It's a playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing. FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Will Connor McDavid be able to bounce back with at least 2 goals in Game 4 for the Oilers going up against the Dallas Stars? Is speedy youngster Ellie De La Cruz going to steal another base for the Reds as he continues to pursue 100 steals in a season? And will we see the Timberwolves bounce back in Game 4 and avoid the sweep with a big game from Anthony Edwards? This is an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. After today's practice, we are now midway through OTAs. And yes, Rob, we've only had one opportunity on the practice field so far to get to see this 2024 Seahawks team. We'll get our second look on Thursday, but it's never too early to start thinking 53-man roster projections. And we know that competitions are well underway. Players are starting to jockey for those last roster spots, whether you're incoming rookies, undrafted guys, your seasoned veterans that are near the bottom of the roster. These practices are still critical to make this football team come the end of August. So we're going to look at the offensive side of the football now. We've talked about our last 5 in and our first 5 out, the players that were on the right side of the bubble and the wrong side of the bubble. Now let's look a little more from a big picture standpoint. And on offense, we got to start with the big and heavies because, Rob, there's 3 offensive positions on the offensive line that, at least based on what the Seahawks have said, are up for grabs. You're going to have new starters at all 3 of those positions. Who do you have making this roster for the Seahawks on the offensive line, and who ends up starting for them in week 1 against the Denver Broncos?
Well, Corbin, I might be a little bit boring here, but I think it's going to be basically the incumbents, at least at the offensive tackle position. I think you're going to have Charles Cross, of course, at left tackle, and Abraham Lucas, barring his recovery from injury at the right tackle position. I think that the Seahawks are pretty much set up nicely with George Fant, of course, coming back to Seattle. Stone Forsythe, I thought, did a nice job when he was pushed into the starting role this past season. And that's where, again, you and I disagree a little bit. I just love the upside of Michael Jarrell. I think that Garrett Greenfield, as you referenced him a couple of moments ago, I think that he's absolutely has a chance here. But I just view young offensive tackles as, a positional group that I think that the Seahawks have some youth, have some athletic ability, have some upside. And I think that if you cut any of those players, then they are likely to be snatched up by other clubs. I think the more likely scenario is that Seattle is going to keep an extra offensive tackle. And so, again, what I currently have it being Jarrell. I think that you can make an argument for Greenfield. There's a couple other tackles on Seattle's roster, but that is the positional group that I do think Seattle might kind of want to bring one other player around just in case. Quickly at the guard positions, Lakeland Tomlinson being my starting right tackle, or starting right, Lakeland Tomlinson being the starting left guard. Anthony Bradford, again, the incumbent, being my starting right guard at this point. That means that the rookie, Christian Haynes, much ballyhooed rookie, I have having to kind of work his way up to be able to kind of wrestle that starting position away from Anthony Bradford. Could he do it? Of course he could. But right now, I'm going to go with the incumbents. Again, Laken Tomlinson, I believe, is a plug-and-play replacement for Damian Lewis at left guard. Anthony Bradford, Phil Haynes at the Christian Haynes, not Phil Haynes, at the left guard position as the back, or right guard position as the backup. Satoa Leomea, as I mentioned, making this roster again as the primary backup. At the center positions, Olu Oluwatimi and Nick Harris. So again, that is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 offensive linemen in total for the Seahawks, making it their biggest positional group overall.
Yeah, where you and I differ when it comes to this 50-man roster right now, I've got one less lineman and one extra tight end. Now, one argument that I was thinking about, George Fant played that sixth offensive lineman role so well for the Seahawks in his first stint with the team. Maybe Seattle considers doing that some. I just can't see Ryan Grubb as the offensive coordinator, though, wanting to do that. I think he's going to want more athletic tight ends that he can get into the lineup to try to really stretch the field. And I think Jack Westover, again, is just a player that I think Ryan Grubb is going to hold in high enough regard from coaching him at Washington that I think both he and A.J. Barn are on this team. And Farrell Brown's on a one-year deal. Those two rookies could be pushing him for playing time quicker than expected. So I think that that's where you and I differ. And the other difference, I've got Christian Haynes starting in week 1. And this is not a knock on Anthony Bradford. I expect this is going to be an intense competition. Bradford's only going to year 2. He started 10 games last year. That gives him a significant advantage. But I just think Christian Haynes is one of those guys. You mentioned plug and play with Laken Tomlinson. I think this is a plug and play coming out of college prospect that's going to start at right guard. But otherwise, you and I are on the same tangent here. Mike Jarrell was one of the last players I had off my list. I could see him playing back onto this when we do this again, heading into training camp. But for right now, I just think that there's a little bit of a logjam at those tackle positions, and they've got a lot of talent at the tight end spot. Now, let's go to the skill positions. Rob, I feel like there's not a lot of drama at running back position. Quarterback, you've got 2 QBs right now on the roster. There's nothing else going to be happening there. But really, it's the bottom of the depth chart at the receiver position where there could be some interesting things that transpire the next couple of months.
Yeah, they're really good. And that's why they get to start looking at body types a little bit. Like, that's one of the reasons why I had D. Eskridge is actually making this squad, because I don't see a lot of straight line speed on Seattle's wide receiver, group. I mean, obviously DK Metcalf is an unbelievable athlete. He's a unicorn. I mean, you can't compare him to anybody else in Seattle's roster, and frankly on most other NFL rosters. And Tyler Lockett, at least back in the day at Kansas State, ran the 4.3s. I don't know that he has that elite breakaway straight line speed anymore. Certainly JSN does not have that. Jake Bobo does not have that. The other wide receiver I have making this squad because of not only his size, but because of his return ability is Laviska Shenault. If you're going to make an argument for, say, a Hayden Hatton, or any of the other wide receivers that are currently on Seattle's roster, I just don't think that they have the make you miss, the breakaway ability that a healthy, motivated D. Eskridge can provide you. Now, will he actually provide that? Hell, who knows? I mean, because he has not shown that over the last 4 years in Seattle. But at the same time, I do believe that he has the upside, that at least at this point here in the later stages of May, that I do think that D. Eskridge is somebody to kind of roll the dice on. To me, D. Eskridge and Laviska Shenault in the very first starting reps, at least in the OTAs that we've been able to see at this point, starting reps at the kick returner position, to me, is one of the intriguing reasons why I think that he has a potential to stay on this roster. And again, that's why I have him right now on this roster.
Yeah, the 2 battles that I'm going to be watching at the skill positions, as you just outlined there at the receiver spot, I still think Derek Young, when you consider the positional flexibility that he provides you, he's played running back. He played some fullback 2 years ago. Last year, he had an injury that just nagged him the entire season. But we've seen him get downfield and make tackles on coverage teams. We've seen him down punts inside the 5-yard line. I mean, he is a really good special teams player. And I also think there's some kick return potential. Again, this is a former running back. I think those kind of guys are going to be good fits with these new rules, returning kicks. I think that's going to be a very close call there, but this might be the deciding factor, Rob. Derek Young's got 2 years left in his deal. D. Eskridge has 1. And that weighs into these when you're talking about guys that are near the bottom of the depth chart. And quite frankly, Young has almost as many catches in the last 3 years than what D. Eskridge does. Crazy enough. I think Bobo is a lock. I know a lot of people are considering that to be a question mark, but listen, Ryan Grubb got to watch this guy at UCLA just absolutely torch Washington a couple of years ago. Had 168 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns against the Huskies. He knows what Jake Bobo can do. He name dropped him a couple times in his intro press conference, unprompted. I think Bobo is a lock as receiver number 4. And I think Laviska Shenault, with his special teams ability, his ability to break tackles, create after the catch, I think he is going to be on this roster. So really, it's Eskridge versus Young for that last spot. And then the running back position, it's Kenny McIntosh against George Halani. And I do think that is going to be a tightly contested battle as long as these two guys can stay healthy. We know McIntosh was banged up last year. Halani's got a lengthy injury history, but both these guys can catch the ball. They are good runners between the tackles. They can do zone and gap schemes. Pass protection probably would be leaning towards McIntosh at this point, but I think that's going to be a fun battle between those two guys in the backfield that ultimately I think McIntosh is going to win. But it's going to be a tight battle, and special teams may boil down who ends up winning that job. When we come back, we're going to switch to the defensive side of the football on our initial 53-man roster projections. We'll be in the trenches, linebackers, and, of course, the safeties and cornerbacks as well. We'll get to those here in a moment on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought your way by our friends at Game Time. You shouldn't have to skip a mortgage payment if you want to see your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Back in April, my wife and I got awesome seats to watch the Avalanche and the Jets in the 5th row near center ice. It was a playoff game, under $125 a ticket. Even though Colorado got clobbered, it was still a blast, and we didn't have to pay an arm and a leg for awesome seats. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Do you have to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for your everyday sports needs. They've got the biggest stories without the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are in the middle of OTAs. The Seahawks wrapping up their 5th OTA practice today. They've only had one open OTA practice so far. We'll get to see the team again on Thursday, but at this stage, we're starting to see the roster come together, where the pieces fit in the puzzle, Rob. So we're diving into our initial 53-man roster projection, the first of what will be a handful of them we'll have here in the next few months. And now looking at the defensive side of the football. We started in the trenches last segment. We got to start in the trenches this segment. There could be some interesting competition in the defensive line because of the addition of Byron Murphy II, Leonard Williams coming back, and all the other players returning, Jonathan Hankins joining the fold. There's going to be some pretty good defensive linemen that have a tough time making this football team.
No, there absolutely is. I mean, this is going to be fascinating. As I mentioned before, I mean, one of my last 5 players out is a player that you and I, Corbin, at different times over the last couple of seasons have basically just kind of, trumpeted his success. And that being Miles Adams is a player I have currently out. I'm curious to see how he is able to perform to perhaps get his way back in. As I have it right now, basically 5 players along the edge, and they're the big names: Boye Mafe and Uchenna Nwosu, of course, being the projected starters. Drummond Jones, I think it's going to be interesting to see where he is able to carve out his niche. And it, every suggestion is that he is going to be on the outside at the linebacker position. And so again, again, I think that it's going to be fascinating to see. But at this point, I do have Mafe and Nwosu as Seattle starters. Draymond Jones, again, coming off of the bench. Darrell Taylor being your edge rusher, your pass rushing specialist on obvious pass rushing downs. And then Derek Hall, I'm intrigued by. But again, we're talking about some of the Seattle's highest paid, highest drafted players. I think the edge rusher position is going to be fascinating. And you slide inside defensive tackle and nose guard. I have 4 traditional defensive tackles in Leonard Williams, Jaron Reed, Cameron Young, and then Mike Morris, who again, like Draymond Jones, I think is going to be a fascinating decision. Just where is he after missing virtually all of last season? Of course, Mike McDonald is going to know him very well, previously coaching him at Michigan, but I think that Mike Morris is going to be a fascinating eval moving forward. And finally, at the big traditional nose guard positions with Jonathan Hankins and Cameron Young, the big guys. I think that Matthew Gotel could make this team. I think that Buda Jones could make this team. I think that the defensive line, Corbin, edge rushers at the outside, stand-up outside linebacker role, traditional defensive ends, traditional defensive tackles, and those big run pluggers. I really think that is going to be a fascinating positional group to watch throughout this entire process.
Yeah, I think there's a couple specific matchups at the bottom of the depth chart. There's clearly guys like Byron Murphy II is going to be on this football team. He's a first-round pick. There's a chance that he's going to start for this team as a rookie. We'll have to see how that plays out. And Draymond Jones is not getting cut or traded. He is going to be on the roster. It's just going to figure out how can we carve out, as you said, the niche for him. Where is he going to be on the edge for most of the early downs? Then, third down, obvious passing situations, slide him inside. I think there's a lot of different things Mike McDonald is excited to do. But it really boils down to me. Mike Morris, yeah, he played for Mike McDonald at Michigan a few years ago. But, Miles Adams might have something to say about that. Mike Morris played in one game last year. I've got Morris making this football team, but I think that is fascinating. Miles Adams has played different spots along the line, and I could see him being a good fit for what Mike McDonald wants to do defensively. So I've got Morris getting that, but I think it's going to be a battle between those two. And I would keep an eye on Matt Gotel because I think this system fits him better than the one Pete Carroll had. And we're talking about a 350-plus pound guy that is pretty darn light in his feet. Cameron Young is not that prototypical nose tackle build. They drafted him in the 4th round, but I think part of that was the defense they were running. So Cameron Young could still very much be part of this team. That's how I have it projected. But I would keep a very close eye on Matt Gotel at that nose tackle position. As for the edge spots, he wasn't in my first 5 out, but Nelson Caesar is the other player that I would keep an eye on. And the player that I think needs to be looking in the rearview mirror here is Darrell Taylor, not Derek Hall. Derek Hall's got 3 years left in his rookie deal. The Seahawks set up the restructured contract for Darrell Taylor where he only got $20,000 guaranteed on that 1-year deal. They can move on from him if he is not one of their best edge guys. If Nelson Caesar comes up and is instantly better against the run and gives him juice as a pass rusher, yeah, he's not the athlete Darrell Taylor is, but this is like D. Eskridge with Darrell Taylor. This is your last shot. You got to prove that you can fit in this scheme. So I have DT making this team, but keep an eye on Nelson Caesar there as well. He was another player that was just on the cusp of making this football team on my 53-man roster projections. Now let's go to the linebackers and the secondary, Rob. And I know that you had a few tough decisions there. The bottom of the cornerback depth chart could be very fascinating. And even those last couple spots at linebacker, you might have a down-to-the-wire competition to make this team.
Yeah, as I just said, I really think the defensive line is going to be fascinating. I was remiss in not mentioning Byron Murphy II, of course, who is going to play a huge role. I wound up actually, I think, mentioning Cameron Young twice, so my apologies for that. I think at the cornerback position, Corbin, we talked about this on offense. Whether it be tight end or wide receiver, those positional battles are going to be fascinating. To me, of all of the positional groups in this entire roster, offense, defense, special teams, cornerback, to me, I think is Seattle's deepest positional group. I think that when you talk about veterans, like I say, Artie Burns, for example, I think that he is going to get squeezed out, considering the back-to-back 4th-round selections that the Seahawks made this past year with the 2 Auburn players, Nehemiah Pritchett and DJ James. So again, that's where I'm going to go here at the cornerback spot. I have Seattle sticking with 6 guys: Devin Witherspoon, of course, Reek Woolen, Trey Brown, Mike Jackson, and then again DJ James and Nehemiah Pritchett. I do think that that this is going to be a fascinating. I thought that Artie Burns was very possibly on the outside looking in until the very last preseason game a year ago, where his ability to play run defense and special teams, I think, got him that job. I don't know that Mike Macdonald is going to be quite as willing to overlook the lack of straight line speed and ball production than perhaps Pete Carroll was willing to look at. So I do think that, again, cornerback is going to be one of the more fascinating positional groups this entire process for the Seahawks.
Yeah, I look at that cornerback group, and I didn't even have Burns in my my first 8 out. I just think that this is a position where he would have been on the bubble before they drafted 2 corners. And with D. Eskridge being cut on this projection, we will see where this goes. But I went back and watched some Auburn tape, and Nehemiah Pritchett, when he was returning kickoffs a few years ago, that dude was explosive, and he was dangerous back there. I have no doubt in my mind the Seahawks are going to give him a very close look for one of those 2 kick return slots. And DJ James, he's got that physical mindset that Mike Macdonald likes. He's got special teams background as well. He's played some in the slot early here for the Seahawks. I just have a feeling that both those guys they just drafted that clearly Mike Macdonald is high on, he is going to be keeping both those players over somebody like an Artie Burns, who they re-signed, but he was one of Pete Carroll's favorite veteran players. This is a different coaching staff. So that's how I see that playing out. And linebacker, Tyrese Knight is on this roster. John Radigan, I think his special teams ability, especially after losing Nick Bellore, he's kind of that de facto captain now on kick and punt coverage team. So it's hard for me to envision those 2 guys not on this team. But Patrick O'Connell might be a player to keep a very close eye on. And Drake Thomas, who you and I both loved coming out of NC State. My question is, what does he look like coming back from an injury? So are those 2 guys going to be in the mix? They could be. That may be a position where John Radigan's got to look over his shoulder because he is on a 1-year deal with the Seahawks as well. So, and he's getting good money too. If those 2 former undrafted players are just as good at a lower price, then you keep one of those guys. So I could see it being competitive, but right now I've got Radigan and clearly Tyrese Knight, their 4th-round pick. They're high on him. Those guys are going to be on the roster. And it's safety where you and I differ. This is just one difference just based on injury. I've got Jarek Reed starting on the PUP list, which allows Kobe Bryant to be on the roster with Kayvon Wallace, Rayshawn Jenkins, and Julian Love. If Reed is healthy, then Bryant is that next player that's off the list because they've already got 6 corners. I don't see him beating out any of the 6 corners they have there. So that's really the main discussion here. Kobe Bryant was my absolute last guy on this roster, and it just boiled down to the Jarek Reed situation. I don't have him beating out any of those corners that you and I both have making this football team.
Yeah, I don't have him beat down those corners. I think that he would be in a tough spot against the Artie Burns, against a Lance Boykin, another undrafted free agent that made this squad. I love that you mentioned the linebacker Drake Thomas. I think that the top 3 safeties are basically written in stone, and Julian Love, Rayshawn Jenkins, and Williams as well. I really think that what's going to be interesting is, again, with Kobe Bryant and Jarek Reed and his health situation, as you mentioned, Corbin. I think that is going to be a fascinating one. Jonathan Sutherland is another undrafted free agent that came back to Seattle, played well. So again, I think that there's some quality safeties on Seattle's roster that I'm kind of interested to see how this all plays out. But I do believe that Jarek Reed, who, as we've talked about before, was Seattle's leading tackler on special teams prior to his injury, that has basically been kind of the stepping stone to getting into the starting roster, at least in the past. I think that Jarek Reed's health is going to play a huge role, not only in his ability to make this 53-man roster, obviously, but in the possibilities for some of the others, as we said with Kobe Bryant specifically as well.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we've got a very special guest that's going to be joining us to break down Seattle's draft class, maybe some of the undrafted rookies as well. We're really looking forward to it. Make sure that you are listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.